Canadian officials are still seeking answers and accountability after news that China executed 4 Canadian citizens. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly says the 4 were all dual citizens and face charges linked to criminal activities and drugs. And what does all of this signal for Canada-China relations? Michael Kovrig is a senior advisor for the International Crisis Group, and as I'm sure you'll recall, he was imprisoned by China for 1,019 days over Canada's arrest of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. Michael, a real pleasure to speak with you. Thanks for joining us.
It's good to be with you, Ian, although I have to say it's a very sad occasion to have to do that. So let me just say at the beginning how tragic and appalling this news is, and that I hope that all Canadians and indeed all people who believe in human rights will join me in expressing the deepest sympathy to the families and loved ones of the deceased. This is a very unfortunate situation.
Yeah, no, a good place to start and a good reminder, the tragedy behind each of these executions. Now, the news became public just as tariffs on canola and seafood came into effect that China has imposed on Canada. What do you make of that timing?
I think it's connected in the sense that it's reflecting a policy by the Chinese government where they're not interested in making any kind of concessions or conciliatory or friendly gestures toward Canada at this time. They could have let the tariffs on electric vehicles go by, recognizing that they were something that it's necessary for Canada to do just to maintain its own automotive industry and protect its own jobs. But they chose to retaliate on that. And they've chosen timing that is particularly complicated and arguably exacerbates the pain for Canada. And as far as these tragic executions go, I think it's essentially China's judicial, or rather political judicial system, grinding forward in a kind of bureaucratic, authoritarian, Leninist way that does this kind of thing, that just moves along through case by case by case, executing many people every year in China. And in this case, they were not willing to listen to the entreaties of Canadian diplomats and Canadian officials who called repeatedly for clemency in these cases. China ignored those requests.
Yeah, and as we reported yesterday, China was critical of Canada, and China said they are a, quote, rule of law country, and so they were following the rule of law when they went ahead with these executions. How would you respond to that?
That's a standard Chinese government talking point, and it's really should just be viewed simply as propaganda. The reality is that the Chinese Communist Party itself doesn't respect the rule of law. The party uses the law as a weapon to enforce its will on citizens and occasionally on foreign countries as well. So let's put these particular cases in context, okay? The Chinese criminal justice system is highly politicized, and anyone passing through it cannot be considered to have had a fair trial or due process by international standards, and certainly not by Canadian standards. The justice system there has a 99% plus conviction rate, and police and prosecutors achieve that by coercing confessions. I know very well myself, I was subjected to that kind of treatment. So the presumption that anyone they arrest is guilty, that makes it very difficult for anyone outside the system to assess whether anyone who's been imprisoned or executed actually did anything wrong.
So a justice system that we cannot trust, and this comes at a time when Canada, obviously in a trade war with the United States, is looking at diversifying markets. Should we consider China a viable trading alternative?
If you mean an alternative to the United States, no, I don't think so. Partly just from purely economic standpoint, there aren't that many things that Canada sells to the U.S. that it's necessarily able to sell to China. China's mostly not going to buy manufactured goods and a lot of services and so on. It's a lot of commodities mainly that are being sold to China. Look, just shipping basic commodities and trading with China on non-sensitive items isn't necessarily problematic in itself, except that if it starts to create dependencies, then it generates leverage, right? It gives China the possibility of doing what it's just done, which is cutting off its purchases of canola to hurt Canada. So what we should really be looking at doing is diversifying trade as much as possible, minimizing the leverage that the PRC has over Canada, and reducing the possibility of it inflicting pain and political pressure on Canada. That doesn't mean stopping all trade, but it does mean being very careful and judicious and understanding that it's such a highly politicized and security-driven environment in China now that it's very difficult for the Canadian government to be able to assure Canadian businesses that they will get fair treatment, or indeed that their executives will be safe if they travel to China, for example. So it's a very risky proposition, and I would advocate strongly for maximum diversification away from China, rather than looking to China as something that will save Canada from challenges it's having with the United States. I would look at other markets, particularly across the Indo-Pacific, for that.
I have some more questions for you, Michael, specifically about your advice for Canadians who want to travel and do business in China, but we'll do that in the next hour of the program. Thank you. Michael, last hour we talked about the tragedy of the executions of 4 Canadian citizens in China. Talk to us a little bit about some of the other Canadians still in custody in China, cases that we should know about.
Sure. Well, one of the longest standing ones, of course, is Hussein Shalil, an ethnic Uyghur Canadian citizen who was detained, in fact, extradited illegally from Central Asia and then taken back to China by Chinese security forces. And he's been held for over a decade in a very tragic situation. Canadian consular officers don't even have access to him, despite the fact that he's a Canadian citizen. And so that is certainly a case where it would be good to see clemency, where it would be preferable if China would release him, or at the very least allow consular access to him and ensure his safety. Another is Robert Lloyd Schellenberg, who, of course, was arrested some time ago and has been subject also to a death penalty when he was resentenced in 2019. And I think there is definitely a political element to that case. And I think we should all be working very hard in any way we can, interacting with the Chinese state to encourage clemency in his case and in the cases of any other Canadians that are in detention in China.
Yeah, so let me ask you more about that. We heard yesterday from Melanie Joly, the Foreign Affairs Minister, that Canada will be steadfast in its, criticism, not accepting the death penalty in any circumstance. Both she and the former Prime Minister tried to intervene, were not successful. Is there a role for average Canadians, for businesses, for just people to try to influence China on these issues?
I think we have to be very realistic that the Chinese government, as it's currently constituted, is very hard for any foreign government or citizen to influence. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be persistent and continue trying, particularly on just broader spectrum issues like trying to encourage China to align its judicial procedures, its criminal procedures with international law and international human rights standards. And so, for example, there are still several countries that impose the death penalty, but it's worth noting that China is, I think, just about the only one that applies it to anything except homicide. Normally, you have to actually kill someone to be subject to the death penalty, but China is quite draconian and imposes it also for drug-related crimes, for example. And I think it would be good for the Chinese government to reduce that kind of punishment. Life in prison is already sufficient and severe punishment. And look, Chinese prisons are not consistent with international United Nations standards, the so-called Mandela rules of conditions of detention. It is already acute suffering to spend time in a Chinese prison. There's no need to also impose the death penalty for deterrence purposes. Being held in a Chinese prison should be ample deterrence already for any crime.
One last question. I'm really interested in your guidance on this. Is it safe for Canadians to do business and travel in China?
It's certainly not completely safe. I mean, the reality is that the Chinese state has now made security its number one priority. The security organs, the police, the Ministry of State Security, and political hardliners are the ones who are calling the shots. And so that is creating an increasingly challenging business environment and also an increasingly risky environment for travel. The reality is, I think, for most normal people, there's not likely to be any major risk, but the problem is you can't eliminate the risk, and the consequences would be personally catastrophic if something happens to you. And it would be very difficult for your government to be able to assist you. That's the reality. You will be largely in the power of the Chinese state, and that is a very dangerous place to be. I think it's worth really understanding that the Canadian government has travel warnings about China. So anyone planning to travel there should read those warnings carefully and be mindful of them. And it's not just simply that, being arrested for a drug offense and, the extreme case of a death penalty. You could be subject to an exit ban. You could be subject to arbitrary detention for shorter periods of time. You could be subject to all kinds of other coercive measures. So there are a number of other risks that people need to be mindful of. Trade and investment with China is increasingly risky, and I think anyone who is considering traveling there or getting involved in business there needs to think very carefully about those risks.
Michael, a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian.
Michael Kovrig, Senior Advisor at the International Crisis Group.